So today I really want to share with you how I made a book cover. I'm going to go over just kind of like what some of my initial ideas were, how I chose the final illustration, picking a color palette, things like that. I initially was going to just put like text over a illustration that I did. I really wanted to like push myself and challenge myself for this project. So I ended up actually taking a class on Skillshare. I took the class by Jessica Hische. If you don't know, she's the artist behind those really gorgeous Barnes & Noble covers. And she has a class basically going over her process, walking you through step by step as she creates a book cover for The Wizard of Oz. Super helpful class. There's so much. I've never taken any kind of typography class or anything like that, and I thought all of the information that she had in that class was super helpful. Highly recommend if you have never tried Skillshare before. I do have a link in the description if you want to try Skillshare for free. If you sign up through my link, you'll get 1 month free of Skillshare, and you can take either Jessica's class or any of the classes that they have on their platform. For this project, I'm going to be recreating the cover of A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. I read this book earlier this year and absolutely loved it. Like after I finished it, I spent like a week up just like constantly thinking about it. Highly recommend the book. I felt like it had a lot of motifs and just symbols and elements that we could pull and use in a book cover. So that's what we're gonna do. And to start out, I am gonna do some thumbnail sketches. Let me back up for a second because before that, I actually jotted down on a piece of paper all the things that I think could go on the cover. So I wrote down characters like Cornelius. Don't roast me in the comments, but I don't know how to pronounce his name. Lucy Gray. I wrote down Dr. Gall. I wrote down like singing, birds. I wrote down Mockingjay. I also wrote down like possession and power because I feel like that's like a big theme throughout the book also. These were just kind of the first things that came to mind, and then once I had this list, I started doing my thumbnail sketches. I do highly recommend getting either like a Pinterest board or just somewhere where you can put a bunch of book covers. I just find it really helpful to look at those for inspiration and then kind of see like composition wise what other people tend to use. The first sketch that I did basically had snow and holding a rose, and I put some snakes around it. This one actually ended up being pretty close to what the final version looks like, which you'll see in a moment. The only thing I didn't really like in this one is I felt like it felt be a little too simple. I also felt like in the book Lucy Gray is such an important character and part of the story. I really wanted to have her on the cover. But I put that one aside just to kind of like leave it for a minute. So the second version I tried similar to the first one, but this time I added Lucy, and I saw a fan art one time of Lucy Gray was in like a bird cage, and I really liked the symbolism of that, and so that's kind of like where the inspiration for this one came from. Is I wanted to see maybe she's in a bird cage and he like has a hand on the cage, because that kind of ties into like the possessive element of the book. So for a third idea, I put Lucy Gray and Snow kind of like back to back, and then in the background I thought, we would have the text on top, but maybe like Dr. Gall in the background or something. The reason I didn't go with this one or didn't end up liking this one is because it almost didn't really show Snow as sinister. I feel like in the first two, I feel like because he's looming over the top half of the cover, it feels more sinister in a way. It's kind of what I wanted, because even though he's like the main character, he's not necessarily like the good guy, So thumbnail number 2, where she's in the birdcage, is actually what I kind of go with at first. I do add in snakes on the side because I really like that, but I end up reworking that as I like go along, just because I felt like there was too much going on, and once I added the text, I felt like it really didn't work. That Skillshare class that I was talking about with Jessica Hische, she actually talks about like figuring out where the text is going to go first. I hadn't taken that class yet whenever I started these thumbnail sketches, and if I had, I would have been able to like plan for where the text was going to go, because like I had a basic idea, but it really hindered the illustration because I had the text covering a good portion of the illustration. So that was a mistake on my part, but after I watched her class, I was like, that makes so much sense. Like that would have been so much easier. But yeah, this final thumbnail is actually really close to what the book cover ends up looking like. I have, President Snow, he's kind of in the background over top of everything. And then I have Lucy Gray like at the bottom, he's still holding a rose, and then there's snakes around the edges. Yeah, I felt like this combined a lot of the thematic elements that I wanted it to. And I also liked the idea of like him looking kind of sinister, and then holding that rose makes him look so like charming, I think, which is kind of funny because I feel like that's very similar to the book where he comes off as like this very charismatic person, and then, you know, as the book goes on, you know, see more and more of like how he's not actually, it's all like a facade really. I end up going with this thumbnail where Lucy Gray is like in a bird cage and snow is kind of looming over her. And like I said, I do end up changing that as I go along in my process, but this is what we start with. I do want to mention about colors. So because the original book cover is green, and green can be very like villainy feeling, that's really the color that I wanted to go with originally, and I tried to make it work, and I feel like it just didn't. Like I could not get it to work. So I'll show you some of the color palettes that I tried but ended up not going with. This is the one that I actually did go with, but you'll see that I do change this later on because once I start looking at the values, like the contrast of the values at that point, I realized that it doesn't quite look right. I ended up making Snow's coat like a darker color so that way it'll contrast better with some of the other colors, and I just did like little tweaks and things just to make sure that everything reads well. Whenever it's in grayscale like this, you can get a better idea of if the colors work together. Then once you add your colors back, you know that it works. And this is where I start to kind of figure out where I want the text to go. And again, this is kind of where I decided that I was going to try to do hand lettering instead of just putting a block of text. And just to kind of show you, this is what with text it would have looked like. I feel like for a portfolio piece, I really wanted to challenge myself and show that I can do more difficult things like hand lettering for book cover illustrations. So that's kind of what I wanted to go with. Jessica's class really came in clutch because, again, I had no idea how to do it. But after following her class, I was able to really work on like where to place the text, little like tiny details that really change the way that the text feels. Overall, I think it came out really well. And after that, I basically am just finishing up the rendering process. I did find a way to, I really wanted to add the Mockingjay symbol. If you can't tell, I was a big Hunger Games fan, like when the books first came out when I was in, I think, middle or high school. So I really wanted to find a way to add in the Mockingjay symbol, and I actually really like that. I thought that was like a cool little like addition to it. And here is the final look. Obviously this went through a lot of changes throughout the process. I think that's a really important part of designing a book cover, is you kind of have to be very flexible and willing to adapt and change, because as you can see, I had to make a lot of changes in the middle of the process when really because I didn't figure out where my text was going to go first. And if I had done that, I think it would have been a lot easier to get the illustration done. Like this illustration took me quite a while actually, just because I kept fiddling with it and I kept messing with things. But I think if you can decide in those early stages how you want the book to look, I think that goes a long way in just making it a lot easier. If you also use Procreate, I do recommend checking out a video that I have that shares a ton of different Procreate tips and tricks that I've used over the years. I use all of them in my workflow pretty consistently. If you want to check that video out, you can do so here. And other than that, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!